Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Improving's virtual Lunch and Learn. Before we get started, I wanted to inform you about a feature in the presentation that will make the session more interactive. Please take note of the question mark icon in the upper right-hand corner of the presentation screen. If you click that icon, it'll open up the question and answer feature, which will allow you to send questions, and I can deliver those to our presenter at the appropriate time. Without further ado, we're excited to welcome Michael Slater, a technical director with Improving, who will be sharing with us feature flags more than just a boolean. Michael, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Max, and welcome everyone to our Lunch and Learn series. Let's go ahead and get started. First, who am I? I am a technical director of Improving, but more importantly, I'm a husband and a brand new father. You can see in that picture my beautiful wife, Catherine, and my new son, Connor. And you'll notice we have a gingerbread house in front of us. Curious story. Over the Christmas holidays, Improving, in lieu of our holiday party, had a gingerbread building competition, and that was our entry. And I have to say, we had one of the more modest houses in the group. Most of these submissions were way beyond this. Awesome, crazy stuff. Maybe one day we'll share it. A little bit more about me is I enjoy cycling. I'm actually team captain of the Improving Bike MS150 team. So if you're also out there ready to do the MS150, hopefully I'll see you on the road. On top of that, I'm a huge gamer, play a lot of video games, and I've even worked extensively in the video game industry, so I'm well versed in all things games. A little more about me, I graduated at University of Houston, computer science, and I actually started my first job there at Intel, funny enough, on the Fortran compiler team. I knew it wasn't my future, but it was the step in the door of a winding career where I would tackle a huge variety of problems in software across academic computing, the corporate enterprise environment, video game industry, coding boot camps, and now for all our clients and customers at Improving. So today we are going to do feature flags. The agenda is really easy. What are feature flags? Types of flags or toggles, speeding up feature delivery, and implementation ideas. By the way, between each one of those major agenda sections, I'm going to have a Q&A slide that looks like this, and there'll even be a little note on the top of my slides letting you know. So please enter your questions in at the moment they come to you, and during each section, Max is going to ask me those questions. So to get started, feature flags. Now, a feature flag is not just a boolean, but at its core, it usually ends up being a boolean in some way. Now, as you can see in this brilliant piece of software, if the enabled boolean is true, then we will go down the path of a new feature, and if it is false, the old feature. Sounds simple enough, right? And even cooler than that, the boolean is controlled by that toggle switch on the left side there where you have on or off. A feature can be on or off, and it's going to affect that path of code. Now, what is a feature? Well, in this context, a feature can be small or huge. It might be a tiny addition to a complicated UI, making your search bar look a little bit different or have a different style of autocomplete. Or it may be an entire section of UI, an entire drop down in your main menu that didn't exist before, and at the click of a toggle, your users now have access to it. I mentioned UIs because they're visible and tangible, but features can also be operational as well. Feature flag may toggle, which changes which email provider sends your app emails to users or other operational aspects of your code. So let's go ahead and take a look at the four main categories of feature flags in use today. The main category and the main type of feature flags that are often referred to are release flags. If you are being told by some evangelist like me that you need feature flags, this is often where we want you to start. Release flags at their core are pretty simple. When a development team starts working on a new feature and they are pushing their code to production, but the feature isn't ready for prime time, the product manager will have the flag turned off in production, but you may have it turned on in your beta environment. And when it's ready to show to certain customers, you may have it turned on in a customer preview environment. It's a pretty simple and effective way to continue development, to release your code into production, but choose when that code is actually exposed and executed in any of your given environments. You could start as I've listed here, a simple on or off switch, and that turns a feature on or off. You may even have a specific group of users, like a beta group, and you target them. There's also ways to do incremental rollout of users, where a percentage of your user base at a time gets exposed to a feature. This last bullet is extremely common in the big technology product industry. Think your big players like Facebook, etc. When they roll out a release, it is slowly exposed to their users over time, and it uses a feature flag system, of course, way more complex than I'm talking about now. Now, you may notice I mentioned the product manager may flip the feature flag switch. So not only are you testing errors and changes in user engagement, I want to point out that the existence of feature flags is a benefit and tool for the software team and the product management team. We're going to go more in depth on why in just a bit later. The second type of flag is an ops flag. This is to change the underlying operational aspect of your software. You may have a complex user ranking algorithm, which processes data and ranks products or items in a certain order. You may choose to have a flag that switches that ranking system between different algorithms, depending on tweaking what you need that day, or perhaps something isn't working, or you got bad press and now you need to change your algorithm. It'd be really handy if you had a flag and you hit the button and boom, it changed. You can also test a new system under production load. You may switch from one service bus processor to another service bus processor and see which one performs better with your production code. You turn it on, watch all the numbers go, and see which one is improved, and you turn it back off if you've got it. This lets you actually have zero downtime migration of systems. So when you're building microservice, for example, and you stand up a new service to replace your monolith, you can flip the switch to have everything quickly redirect to the microservice. See if it works out, and if it doesn't, flip it back off and your application continues as normal. And the big fourth way that ops flags are helpful are what I call circuit breakers, or the whole industry calls them circuit breakers. And this is where features can be turned off because your application is under extreme load and you need all available CPU power to go to your core product. In fact, we saw this as a giant industry in the stock market last week. If you saw the trading frenzy happen, you may have realized that a bunch of different stockbroker apps turned off lots of features. My Fidelity app turned off their newsfeed and a bunch of analysis features, but the core trading product was still working. They did that because they were under such extreme load, things had to keep working, right? So ops toggles can effectively be circuit breakers that help you under heavy load. Permission flags. I mentioned earlier that you may want to release a feature to beta users. This is very similar to a release flag, but it's a targeted release flag to a group of users or even one user. So you may have a set of customers that opted into seeing all the beta versions of your software product. And these are, usually your champions, and they're going, oh, I found an error, and that actually makes them happy and excited. And on your side, you get free testing. So you may have a beta permission flag, an alpha permission flag. You may also have flags to turn on to give certain users power user modes because you want to give them more flexibility than, your pretty UX screens. Permission flags have a lot of similarities to release flags, but they tend to stick around longer because you build a permission flag system that you can reuse over and over again. And our last type of flag, and it's my favorite type of flag, is the experiment flag. This is colloquially, referred to as A/B testing, and it is potentially the most rewarding form of feature flagging. It is common among especially tech-forward software products to have an in-depth experiment flag system. Now, experiment flags involve a control and a variation. You have the same feature, but the feature you've always had, and then a tweak to it, a variation. You've done something that makes it a little bit different. You've changed the user experience, or you've changed the way it processes, etc. Right? This lets you test between users to see, hey, do my users like what I've always had, or are they going to like this change, right? A simple example is the checkout workflow of an e-commerce website. If you've ever worked in e-commerce before, you know the checkout user experience is an extremely delicate part of your website. And it is where your customers will either finalize their order and charge their credit card and in fact getting you revenue, or they close the browser window because they changed their mind for who knows what reason, right? And many giant e-commerce platforms put a lot of product management time into A/B testing their checkout workflow to see, hey, if we change it just a little bit here, will that increase the sticking power where people complete the workflow? And if you think about this in, let's say, Amazon, changing their checkout workflow, small tweaks, even if they see a 0.5% increase in successful checkouts, that can be millions of dollars. So this is an extraordinarily potentially rewarding type of feature flag. It can also go terribly wrong. Depending on how you separate users into control or variations groups, you can actually taint your experiments and create biased results. For example, if a user has used the current feature before and they get launched into the experiment group, they may have a bad reaction, say, hey, I'm not used to this, I like the old UI better. You know, even if the new UI is factually better, right? So there has to be a lot of thought process and decision making and contextual information that goes into your experiment engine that decides, hey, should this user see the control or should they see the variation? Something to warn you about. So while experiment flags may be the most complex type of feature flag by an order of magnitude, they are also the most rewarding form from a product management perspective. So in review, I have our 4 flags here, and we have a chart with longevity and dynamism. So the longevity is how long this flag is going to stay in your system. You'll see release toggles are near the bottom. They don't stay in your system for long. Once you put a feature out and then it turns on and you verify it's working and you're going to keep it, you're pretty much going to remove that flag from the system. As opposed to permission toggles, it's at the top there, they may stick around because you're going to reuse permission groups, right? Ops flags, the longevity is longer as circuit breakers become permanently needed fixtures as a scaling mechanism, right? But if you're using an ops toggle as, let's say, a system migration, that's lower down on the months or weeks. So it just depends. Experiment flags, they are short-lived, but they're on the right side of dynamism. These can change often with every request. It's not just an on or off. It's on if these 100 conditions are true for the current user using the system. And real quick, we'll take some questions. You got any for me, Max?
Yeah, Michael, we got a question that came in. Lisa wrote, what is another scenario of an experiment flag?
So I mentioned an e-commerce website really cares if a user completes a checkout workflow. But let's say you're sort of some game company and you want people to successfully complete an objective, right? But there you have a low success rate. You may test variations, say, hey, what gets people to, you know, complete the mission or do this or do that? This is actually very common in games, very common in MMOs. Product teams have huge Hadoop clusters that help them drill down into the data, find these problems, and change their games. So that's another scenario. It's used heavily in the gaming industry too.
Nice. Yeah, so that's the only question we had during this section.
Awesome. All right, so next up we have feature flags and DevOps. Now, this is a huge step back, right? What is DevOps again? Well, let's talk about it because feature flags matter a lot inside of DevOps. For software teams to see more benefits from agile practices, a faster cycle of development is needed. Now, faster cycles don't mean code's written faster, though your product manager is going to appreciate that, but it means it puts your code in production faster, right? It decreases the amount of time from when you commit your code to source control to running it in the production environment. So DevOps is extending agile principles beyond the code to the entire delivery of your product, and to speed up not only the iteration of writing code in sprints, but the iteration of building your code and releasing it to production, right? And we see systems that come up like infrastructure automation. This is where your operating systems, such as especially in Docker and Kubernetes these days, or in cloud native environments using Azure resource templates, is code itself and can automatically build and deploy your entire infrastructure. Now, why does this matter? Well, when we get into the concept of continuous integration, which has been around forever, that is when your build server, takes a build, builds it, runs unit tests, and maybe delivers it to a dev environment after the pull request is accepted. That's continuous integration. That's where code from developers is continuously integrated together, but not released to production. Continuous delivery is the next step. That's where after continuous integration, you have a quick next step to delivery where you may automatically or with a few quick clicks of approvals also deploy that build to production, right? So instead of writing each PR and every time you get a pull request submitted, it goes to dev, it may go straight to prod every time. And you have set up a crazy amount of infrastructure automation, test automation to make all of this possible and safe. Going on, most of us know the routine of the software project development, right? So let's go right back down to that agile methodology of coding. We organize our work, assign it to developers, and they in turn write code and turn the ideas into features. And this happens for most product teams on a 2-week cadence. The problem is features aren't completed in nice 2-week intervals. Sometimes they're in a few days, sometimes they extend beyond sprints over the course of 24 user stories, right? It can take a while to finish writing all of the code that turns a long feature into something usable. Well, when you think of how developers organize code, they may have to have a long running feature branch like you see at the top here, that it is a branch off the code while they continuously develop, but they feel they can't merge it into the pipeline to go to integration or to production until it's ready, right? Now, feature flags flips that on its head, right? The first step in making a feature branch is you make the feature flag and you protect all future code behind the flag in some way, right? And there's a lot of tricks into that. We're not going to get to it in this talk, but it is definitely possible. And then at the end of every story, not only are they able to merge into integration, they could go straight to production, and that flag is off. And nothing changes for the end users, even though the code's in production because they've locked it away behind a feature flag, right? This eliminates the friction and chaos in development, right? Feature branches no longer need to be rebased often with the main branch. There's much less merge conflicts needing resolution. When libraries or your software architecture changes in a feature branch, that change is reflected more quickly in your main branch so other developers on your team can quickly reuse those concepts, right? This keeps developers productive and more focused on getting the job done. Now, this goes into a concept called release risk management, right? Developers always do think of risk when they do a release, but developers are thinking, what if my code breaks? I had particularly crazy code on a tight deadline, and I really hope QA caught all the big issues and we don't get flooded with bug reports. That is sometimes in my mind when we do releases, especially without feature flags. Another risk developers consider is performance impact. What if I wrote a really slow database query and it's killing the server, right? What if I change system architecture that's going to cause widespread outage? What if the library I upgraded is going to cause issues? There's so many problems that can crop up on the technical side of risk in a delivery of software, right? But there are the risks that developers don't think about as often, but I guarantee you product managers are thinking about them, right? That is, what if your users use a feature and it works perfectly fine, but they hate it? They use it and go, wow, this is terrible. You didn't talk to me. You don't know what I want. Change it back. Well, that's called product risk, right? If you don't have an easy, simple mechanism to change it back, you may have to roll back a build or do something crazy. There may have been database changes you may not be able to roll back because your software team's not that mature. There could be all sorts of issues. But if it is protected behind a feature flag, that risk is mitigated because that feature flag can be turned on or off despite the deployment, right? You can release that feature through the flag. And this gets into the concept of separating deployments and releases. For most software teams, a deployment is a release. It deploys and the features are out. But the more you do feature flagging, deployments and release become much more separated. And you can separate and mitigate these risks. You still have technical risk in a deployment because, of course, the code is changing. But if all your feature flags, all your features are behind feature flags, the product risk is much lower and mitigated. And the product management team can actually have their own sprints and turn these on and make it happen on their own time. And that goes further into the concept of incremental rollout. A lot of these feature flag systems support the soft delivery of features on top of flags, right? You deploy your build with the new features off, right? And you have a couple options. You turn them on or off. You turn on incremental. You use those permission-based flags we talked, the ops toggles to change your things, or it may be an experiment. And instead of doing this blue-green environment, which is a, hey, I have my old working production and I switch to my new working production, and if things go bad, I can switch back, right? That's your typical blue-green deployment. Instead, you can still have your blue-green deployment, but when you go to blue, you only have to switch back if you have an exceptional failure of the product. But you haven't turned those features on, so you can turn those on slowly, and you have less reason to ever fall back on your green, right? And at the end of all this, of course, you remove your own flags. Any questions up to this point, Max?
Yeah, Michael, we have a few. So I'll start off with one that actually came in right at the end of the previous section, which says, Daniel was asking, what systems or patterns do you recommend for managing these flags?
If you're talking about like software design patterns, a common pattern you see is the factory pattern, right? You have a feature, comes out of a factory, and inside of the factory can be what's called a feature router, which contains your feature flag information, and the factory will create, your submodule with either your new feature or old feature. That's a very common pattern, especially in the backend. Now in the UI, you may do something similar. If you're thinking like Angular, for example, modern Angular, you may decide which component, Angular component to load, your new component or your old component, and bring it up. And that's in a component router in Angular. And I'm sure in React, you may have similar methodologies. So that's a common pattern. Of course, when development teams are getting started, they do just default to some, simple features with simple if-else statements directly from the feature service. Is, feature service dot my feature flag enabled, true or false. That is, of course, the most common thing you see. And that's where I would start. Other than that, I can point you at the end of this, if you hit me up on Twitter or something, to more resources, especially Martin Fowler on his big article on feature flags. He goes over more common software design questions on how to solve this at the code architecture level.
Awesome, thank you. So this is a pretty kind of in-depth question, so try to follow me with it. You're saying that you can and should potentially use release flags because the code is incomplete or has bugs. Should you get the rest released while other devs continue to work on a certain feature? And does that give you a quick way to do rollback?
Yeah, so the first part of that question was, you are releasing to production potentially broken features. That is okay. That is part of the benefit of feature flags. And hopefully it's communicated, don't turn that flag on in production. But you may have it turned on in a beta environment because you're testing a part of the feature that does work. I hope that answers the first part. Can you repeat the second part of that question?
Yeah, it says basically, so you can then get the rest released while other devs continue to work on a certain feature. And does that give you a quick way to roll back? I think you answered that earlier.
Yeah, exactly. So you have some flags that are broken. You definitely don't turn those on, but some feature flags went out in your deployment that are ready to go, and those can be turned on. And of course, if they don't work, it's a quick rollback because you simply toggle the flag back off. And that gets into, I don't know if I touched on it, but ideally your feature flag system at its best doesn't need a deployment or a restart of your application. That flipping the flag is instant, whereas the next time that code path is executed, the flag is changed. Now, we'll cover it in implementation, but it is also acceptable if you change flags that it has to reboot your server. I consider that an acceptable first step if you ever have to get there.
Got it. There's another question in, but I think that you're going to probably get into it. It was talking about implementation, so I'll hold off on that one. But there is another question, just kind of, do feature flags increase the amount of testing that I need to do with flags on or off?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I know no one wants to hear that, but it does. You have to test, as a developer, we all test our code. You have to test with it on or off. Now, if you're using good patterns, you've independently unit tested the new feature, and the old features, hopefully, if you've been unit testing, already tested, right? And you may just have an integration test, for your feature flag service. Hey, does it actually go to the new feature or old feature based on the flag, right? You may have that test, but beyond that, of course, you should be, launching your application with both the flag on or off as a developer. If you have QA department, or members on your team, they need to test it with both. And your automated system should be able to do that as well. Interestingly, though, you can put your build through 2 runs of QA, one with it off and one with it on, and both should work, right? Because if you have automated QA systems, you've written Selenium test or Cypress.js, you've written tests that not only test both versions of this feature flag, the tests themselves are aware of the feature flag for the automated QA environment and can figure that out. So it is more work, but if you've already gotten to that practice of automated testing and a rigorous test methodology, it's not that much more work, is what I would say. I've been on product teams earlier in my career where we feature flagged everything. And at first, when I first joined that sophomore team, it did seem like it took me a little bit longer, but I would write code that morning and it would be in production that afternoon all the time. Or I would work on something and it'd be, huge, and it would already be in production the next day, because once you build your technical suite of tests, automation, etc., you start realizing how fast the product moves. And even though sometimes development feels slower, the product management team is just excited because they are getting things fast, and they love it, and they're able to turn things on or off at their own cadence. And it really makes the entire cadence of the product speed up, even if it changes how you spend some of your time as a dev. And that does, though, go into the balance of how many feature flags you should have in the first place, because you don't have to feature flag everything.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. That's all that we have for this section.
All right. So next up, let's talk about some good practices for feature flags. And I touched on this a little bit in the Q&A. How many flags should you have? Well, I'm going to give you my classic consulting answer. It depends, right? So it depends on your capabilities, your team size, the types of features coming out, and whether or not it's worth flagging them. Like, you may be making product changes like, this is just a change. There's little to no risk. We're not flagging it, or we have to upgrade the screen. We can't go back for a myriad of reasons, so we're not going to bother flagging it because we have to go forward, right? And you may just decide that certain features that do take a little bit to develop do have to go down that slower iterative path of, a feature branch development. But hopefully that decreases with time. It's a balancing act, right? I would say, though, as your team increases competency and your tools get better, it gets easier to have more flags. It's definitely a process with a ramp up. Proper naming. Names need to be very clear, concise, and meaningful. And not just to the software team, they need to be clear, concise, and meaningful to your product manager without a developer explaining it to them. They just need to be super clear. Think of how delicately, sometimes we namespace our software classes. Like some feature flag names can get kind of long, which is okay. Or your feature flag system may support the feature flag name and a description, and that way when you create the flag, you have to provide a description. But you need to have concise naming, because when we get to the last team, product team flag access, a lot of people are going to have access to these flags. It is a great practice to have flag history. You need to be able to see the history of a flag when it went into production for the first time, each time it was toggled and by who, and then you need to have an indicator that says how long it's had since it was last toggled. And that goes into flag lifecycle. So if a flag has been toggled on for, let's say, 2 weeks, that might be the time where you say, hey, let's go ahead and merge in the cleanup source control branch, where we actually remove the flag or remove the old feature from code so we don't carry that tech debt forward, right? And especially for release toggles, you want to keep that a tight timeline, because once your feature turns on and it's validated by the product team and their validation cycle, it's time to remove it, right? Because if you let those things accumulate, it gets really nasty. The product team flag access. Now, your product team is your Scrum team, your Agile team, the developers, your quality assurance team, and it is your product managers, right? At least the product managers that are very close to the daily operations of the product. They should have enough contextual knowledge, information to understand when they should flip the flag on or off. And ideally, the best implementation and rollout, like if you were to get to the top of feature flagging, product managers see the feature flag come in the system. They see the feature flag notes that, hey, this flag is ready to be turned on at your discretion, Mr. Product Manager. And the product manager can basically turn it on without even letting the dev team know. And they have all the metrics. They have, everything they need to see, like user engagements through in an analytics system, et cetera, to decide for themselves this feature flag has had a good release. And that speaks to the diagram up here I have. And this is from one of the really good SaaS companies doing feature flag as a service. You have your agile test-driven development where you have release inspection at the top, but then below you have your deployment and then release, turn on, launch, user engagement, and then a little green arrow, which is turning the flags on. And that's from one deployment, it's showing product managers can have a short iteration cycle of turn the flag on, test it, okay, great, turn the next flag on, test it, okay, great. Your product management team, if they're in control of flag management, they can design their own agile processes and sprints around turning these flags on instead of waiting on the development team's processes and agile sprints, right? And they can have a more asynchronous work setup to the development team. It speeds everything up. I'm telling you, it's awesome. It is a scary idea to get, though, a team to that point. So implementing feature flags, let's talk about some different ways to do it. Most teams start at the top here, which is live configuration based. Now, if you deploy your app to Azure portal or you're deploying to Kubernetes, in Azure, you can go into the portal and go to the app settings. If you change a setting, it restarts your app and applies immediately. That is definitely a good V1 of feature flags. And let me tell you why. You should absolutely experiment that feature flags are going to work for your team, that you're technically capable of doing them. Your product manager understands the concept that you deployed, but that doesn't mean you've released yet and you turn it on. And you almost go through this in a very methodical, slow approach. And you get everyone on board with the mental shift it takes to see a feature flag. And the lowest barrier to entry is absolutely app configs, environment variables, or even a database table is perfectly fine. And this gets you a proof of concept. In fact, it can get you pretty far before you move on to a feature flag service or product. Now, especially if you are yourself a consumer-facing app or in any way facing the public internet, it's pretty easy to get off the ground with a full-fledged feature SaaS product. Launch Darkly, CloudBees, ConfigCat, Split, and there's more. There's a couple more out there. These are just ones I found in my research. And they have all the features I mentioned They have SDKs for many programming languages, right? And they usually all have a REST API where you can do it in a pure REST API manner, but the SDKs make things easy. And they get you off the ground quickly, and they come with a bunch of tutorials, support, advice, and things that just work, right? And they have an entire feature flag service that is tested, tried, and true. And especially if you want to get into experiment A/B testing, these SaaS products have a lot of expertise here that you don't have to build yourself, and you get to buy it. Right now, if you don't want to buy a product, you want to go free, or you don't want, you're an enterprise application and you're not allowed to talk to the public internet, you can launch an open source project inside of your protected networking environment. I've actually personally used Unleash on several projects that I did in an enterprise environment, and it works wonderfully. It gives you a nice little website that stands up, and the product manager is able to log in, flip the toggles, and it comes with some SDKs. At the time, I think I used it in Java, and it works great. I also used it in Angular. Of course, it's not going to be as fancy, maybe a little bit rough around the edges, but as long as you keep it running, it's going to work, and it can get you all the way. And I know Unleash and probably these others even have the experiment systems. They may just not have as much sophistication in the experiments. You may have to build that part yourself, right? And those are your open source answers. I've even now seen Azure has had Azure App Configuration for a while, and that has a feature flag system built in. So even the giant cloud vendors, AWS and GCP, if they don't already have it, may not be far behind, have a native cloud product that does this as well. And then you can roll that into your application. And of course, I don't have an icon for it, but you can always roll your own feature flag system. I have seen a rolled your own feature flag system, and it was super advanced and super good. It also predated almost all of these products. It was ahead of its time. So they didn't have a choice, but it was a tech product team that made, lots of microtransactions, and they needed a feature flag system to test experiments, and they rolled their own. I generally don't recommend you go down this route unless you have such the size and expertise of an engineering team that it makes sense for you. And maybe your product, it needs a roll your own because of just the intricacies of it. But again, always don't roll your own unless you really can't help it. And that's it. So I hope you enjoyed this talk. I'll take any last questions. You got anything from me, Max?
Yeah, it's really an ask, and I think the last slide is really good. You got all of your information up on how to reach you, which is just simply, is this a presentation you could do for our engineering team?
Yeah, absolutely. I do it for some of our clients, potential clients, or just anyone. I think I'm even giving this at a user group later. I can definitely come and deliver this to anyone who emails me or hit me up on LinkedIn. And yeah, I can come out and do a lunch and learn. I can also tailor it a little bit, like if you're using a certain technology stack or you want to see some examples. I have, a case study or two where I can show, and I can even pull together some code samples. Like if you have to use an open source or you're interested in a SaaS product, definitely willing to help you out there.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for attending Improving's virtual lunch and learn today. And Michael, thank you for sharing. There's also a recording of the session will be available on our virtual events page at improving.com/virtual-events. Outside of that, everybody have a great weekend, and we'll see you next time.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining.